In what should have been just another routine episode of Family Feud, an unexpected confrontation transformed the game show into a battleground against bigotry. No one in that studio expected to witness the most jaw-dropping moment in daytime television history. What started with a vile comment from the audience ended with a public takedown so devastating that network executives almost couldn't air it. And what Steve Harvey did next would change everything. Letitia Johnson never expected to be at the center of a national controversy when she brought her family to the Family Feud studio that day. A 34-year-old single mother of 3 working 2 jobs while finishing her nursing degree. Letitia had overcome countless obstacles just to stand on that stage. Her radiant smile masked years of struggle, determination, and sacrifice. Qualities Steve Harvey immediately recognized when he greeted the Johnson family before filming began. "You folks ready to win some money today?" Steve asked, his trademark grin lighting up the room as he straightened his perfectly tailored suit jacket. "More than ready," Letitia responded confidently, her eyes gleaming with hope. "My kids need this for college, and Mama didn't come here to lose." The audience erupted in cheers as the Johnson family took their positions. Letitia stood proudly alongside her sister Tamika, brother Marcus, cousin Darnell, and Aunt Gloria, all of them dressed in matching custom t-shirts that read, "Johnson Family, Bringing the Heat." What should have been Letitia's moment of triumph, however, was about to be tarnished by an ugly incident that nobody saw coming. In the third row of the studio audience sat Gregory Whitman, a 46-year-old real estate developer from the affluent suburbs of Los Angeles. His pressed chinos, golf polo, and expensive watch screamed privilege, a stark contrast to his sour expression. From the moment the Johnson family was introduced, Gregory's face had twisted into a scowl. As the game progressed and Letitia successfully answered question after question, his muttered comments became increasingly audible to those sitting nearby. "Another welfare queen getting handouts," he whispered to the uncomfortable woman beside him, who edged away in disgust. "Bet she's got different fathers for each kid." A young couple in front turned around briefly, shooting him disapproving glances before focusing back on the game. But Gregory seemed oblivious to their reaction, his resentment growing with each point the Johnson family scored. The tension in Gregory's section of the audience grew palpable as Letitia's family pulled ahead in the game. The cameras caught none of this brewing storm, focused instead on the joyful competition happening on stage. The Johnson family was on fire, with Letitia's quick-witted answers delighting both Steve and the audience. Behind the scenes, however, several production assistants had already noticed the disturbance and alerted their supervisors through their headsets. "We've got a situation in Section C," whispered one PA to the floor manager. "Some guy making racist comments. Keep an eye on him," came the response. "Security's been notified." The game continued, with the Johnson family now ahead by 276 points. Their opponents, the Peterson family from Ohio, were good sports despite falling behind. The atmosphere in the studio was electric as the Johnsons prepared for the final round. "Y'all are killing it today," Steve exclaimed, genuinely impressed by their performance. "Letitia, you're up for fast money. You ready?" "Born ready, Steve," she replied, smoothing down her dress and taking a deep breath. As Letitia stepped forward for her turn at Fast Money, the crowd's enthusiasm reached a fever pitch. Steve guided her through the rules one more time, while her family cheered her on from the sidelines. The timer began, and Letitia fired off answer after answer with remarkable speed and accuracy. "Name something people are afraid of," Steve prompted. "Spiders," Letitia answered without hesitation. "Good answer. Name a place where people speak in whispers." "Library." Name something that comes in pairs. Shoes. With each correct response, the audience clapped louder, and the points accumulated rapidly on the board. When the final bell rang, Letitia had scored an impressive 192 points on her own, nearly enough to win the entire round without her cousin's help. It was during this particularly enthusiastic celebration, Letitia jumping with joy as she realized how well she'd done, that Gregory finally crossed the line. Standing up partially in his seat, his face flushed red with indignation, his voice rose above the applause with crystal clarity. "That's right. Dance like the monkey you are," he shouted, the vile words slicing through the celebratory atmosphere like a knife. "Go back to the jungle where you belong." The studio went silent in an instant. The cheering died mid-syllable, replaced by shocked gasps and horrified expressions. Cameras kept rolling, but the joy had been sucked out of the room as if someone had opened a vacuum seal. Letitia froze mid-celebration, her face falling as the words registered, her outstretched arms slowly dropping to her sides. Her youngest daughter, who had been watching proudly from the family section, grabbed her mother's hand, confused by the sudden shift in mood. For 3 excruciating seconds, not a sound could be heard except for the gentle hum of the studio lights. The production team stood paralyzed, unsure whether to cut to commercial or continue filming. The other contestants looked around in disbelief, trying to identify the source of the hateful outburst. Letitia's sister Tamika moved protectively toward her, while Marcus clenched his fists, his eyes scanning the crowd. The weight of that cruel statement hung in the air, like toxic smoke, suffocating the previous joy and excitement. But what Gregory didn't realize was that Steve Harvey had heard every word, and what was about to happen would change both their lives forever. Steve Harvey stood motionless at his podium, his signature smile vanishing as the racist words echoed throughout the studio. For a man known for his quick wit and constant humor, this uncharacteristic silence spoke volumes. The cameras captured his transformation in real time. From jovial game show host to a man confronting something far more serious than family-friendly entertainment. 20 years in comedy clubs, 15 years in television, decades of experiencing racism firsthand. All of it crystallized in this moment as Steve's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing with an intensity that made the cameramen instinctively zoom in. "Cut to commercial." A producer's voice crackled through the crew's headsets. But Steve raised his hand, a silent command that everyone in the production team understood immediately. "No," he said firmly into his microphone, his deep voice resonating throughout the now silent studio. "We're not cutting. We're not going to commercial. We're going to deal with this right here, right now." The floor director froze. Clipboard clutched to her chest. The network executives watching the live feed from their offices leaned forward in their chairs. This was unprecedented. Steve Harvey was effectively taking control of a multi-million-dollar production in real time. "Which one of you said that?" Steve asked, stepping away from his podium and walking to the edge of the stage. His gaze swept across the audience, not with the playful energy he typically brought to Family Feud, but with the focused intensity of a man on a mission. "I want to know right now who made that comment." The audience members glanced nervously at each other, many eyes turning toward Gregory's section. Gregory himself seemed to shrink in his seat, the bravado that had fueled his outburst rapidly evaporating under Steve's scrutiny. "Security, can you please bring up the house lights?" Steve continued, never taking his eyes off the audience. "I want to see everybody's face real clear." As the house lights brightened, Gregory attempted to slide down in his seat. But the people around him had already created a visible gap, leaving him exposed. A woman 2 seats away pointed directly at him. "It was him, Mr. Harvey," she said loudly. "He's been making comments the whole show." Steve's eyes locked onto Gregory, who now sat rigid with fear, the blood draining from his face. For 10 full seconds, Steve simply stared at him, allowing the tension to build to an almost unbearable level. When he finally spoke, his voice was unnervingly calm. "Sir, would you mind standing up for me?" It wasn't really a question. Gregory hesitated, looking desperately for an escape route that didn't exist. 2 security guards had already positioned themselves at the ends of his row. "Stand up," Steve repeated, his voice dropping an octave lower. Slowly, Gregory rose to his feet, his eyes darting around like a cornered animal. "What's your name, sir?" Steve asked, microphone gripped tightly in his hand. Gregory," he stammered, his previous confidence nowhere to be found. "Gregory," Steve repeated, testing the name as if examining a specimen. "Tell me something, Gregory. Do you have children?" The question caught Gregory off guard. Yes, 2 daughters." Steve nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "2 daughters, and I'm assuming you love them? Would do anything to protect them? Give them every opportunity in the world?" Gregory nodded mechanically. "And if someone came up to one of your daughters and called her a monkey? Told her to go back to the jungle? How would that make you feel, Gregory?" The audience was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming through the vents. Every camera was focused on this exchange, capturing what was quickly becoming the most raw, unscripted moment in daytime television history. I didn't mean," Gregory began, but Steve cut him off with a raised hand. No, I'm genuinely curious. How would you feel if someone degraded your child that way? In public, on what should have been one of the proudest days of their life?" Gregory stood speechless, sweat now visibly beading on his forehead. Steve turned momentarily toward Letitia, who remained at her spot on stage, her face a mixture of hurt and dignity. "Ms. Johnson, I want to apologize to you and your beautiful family. What just happened is not what Family Feud is about. It's not what I'm about. And it's certainly not what America should be about." He turned back to Gregory, his voice gaining strength. "You see that woman there? The one you just insulted? Let me tell you a few things about her that you missed while you were busy judging her skin color. Letitia works 2 full-time jobs while studying to become a nurse. 2 jobs. She's raising 3 incredible kids on her own after her husband was killed serving our country overseas. Those children have straight A's in school. Her oldest just got accepted to Howard University with a partial scholarship." The audience began to murmur in support, several members nodding in approval. She came on this show not for herself, but to try to win money to complete her children's college funds. And in the 30 seconds I spoke with her backstage, she showed more class, dignity, and intelligence than you have demonstrated in your entire time in this studio." Steve was building momentum now, pacing the stage with purpose. The producers had long since abandoned any thought of cutting to commercial. This was television gold, albeit of a kind they never expected. "Now, I've spent my career making people laugh. That's what I do. But there's nothing funny about racism. There's nothing funny about trying to rob someone of their humanity. And there is definitely nothing funny about what you just said to this amazing woman." Steve paused, taking a deep breath. The studio was completely in his grip, every person hanging on his next words. When he spoke again, his voice had taken on a new quality, not anger, but something more powerful. Conviction. You know, my grandfather used to tell me something. He said, "Steve, there are two kinds of people in this world. Those who build others up and those who tear others down. Today, sir, you've shown us exactly which kind you are." Steve turned to the security guards. "I think it's time for this gentleman to enjoy the rest of his day somewhere else. But before you go, Gregory, I want you to look at Miss Johnson and her family and do something I doubt you've done much in your life. Apologize. Sincerely." Every eye in the studio turned to Gregory, whose face had gone from white to crimson. The moment stretched on, the silence becoming increasingly uncomfortable. What happened next would determine whether this incident ended in continued hostility or something more redemptive. But either way, Steve Harvey had made one thing abundantly clear. In his house, disrespect would never go unchallenged. Gregory stood frozen in place, the weight of hundreds of eyes bearing down on him. The studio air felt thick and electric as Steve Harvey waited for the apology he had demanded. But instead of contrition, something else flickered across Gregory's face. A stubborn resistance, a doubling down. "I don't owe anyone an apology," Gregory said, his voice surprisingly steady despite his visible discomfort. "This is America. Free speech." A collective gasp rippled through the audience. The camera operators exchanged glances of disbelief. In the production booth, executives were frantically discussing whether to cut the feed. But curiosity about Steve's response kept their fingers hovering above the emergency commercial break button. Steve's expression shifted, not to anger, but to something more devastating. Disappointment mixed with resolve. He slowly removed his suit jacket, carefully folded it, and handed it to a nearby production assistant. The deliberate nature of this action sent a clear message. Steve was rolling up his sleeves, metaphorically and literally. "Free speech?" Steve repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "Let me educate you on something, Gregory. Free speech means the government can't arrest you for what you say. It doesn't mean there aren't consequences for being ignorant in my house." Steve stepped closer to the edge of the stage, now just 15 feet from where Gregory stood. "You know, I grew up in Cleveland. Not the nice parts. I've been homeless. I've slept in my car. I've washed my clothes in gas station bathrooms." Steve's voice gained strength with each sentence. "And through all that, I never once blamed anyone else for my struggles. I certainly never tried to make myself feel better by putting others down." The audience began to murmur in support, several people nodding vigorously. "But you," Steve continued, pointing directly at Gregory, "you've got a good job, nice clothes, probably a comfortable home. And still, something in you is so broken, so twisted, that you feel the need to attack a woman you've never met just because of her skin color." Gregory shifted uncomfortably, but maintained his defiant stance. "You're making this into a bigger deal than it is." Steve's eyebrows shot up. Am I? Am I really?" He turned to Letitia on stage. "Miss Johnson, would you say I'm making this a bigger deal than it is?" Letitia, who had been watching the exchange with remarkable composure, stepped forward to her microphone. The entire studio held its breath. "Mr. Harvey," she began, her voice strong despite the emotion behind it. "Every day of my life, I've dealt with people like him. People who look at me and see only my skin, not my humanity. I teach my children that we don't let those people define us. We rise above." She turned her gaze directly to Gregory. "So, no, sir. This isn't a small deal. This is about whether my children grow up in a world where they're judged by their character or by their color, and I refuse to be silent about that. The studio erupted in applause, several audience members rising to their feet. Steve nodded appreciatively at Letitia, a look of profound respect on his face. "See, Gregory," Steve said when the applause died down, "that right there is class. That's dignity. Something you clearly know nothing about." One of the security guards moved closer to Gregory, clearly expecting Steve to have him removed, but Steve raised his hand to stop him. "Not yet," Steve said. "I want to understand something first." He fixed Gregory with a penetrating stare. "What made you think it was okay to say what you said? I'm genuinely curious." Gregory, now visibly sweating under the studio lights and intense scrutiny, shifted his weight from one foot to another. "Look, I just don't think these shows should be about, pushing certain types of families. Traditional values are being eroded and—" "Traditional values?" Steve interrupted, his voice rising for the first time. "Like what? Respect, hard work, family? Because from where I'm standing, Ms. Johnson embodies every one of those values more than you ever could." Steve began pacing the stage, gesticulating with growing passion. "You know what your problem is, Gregory. You're a coward. Only a coward attacks a single mother trying to win money for her kids' education." The audience responded with another wave of applause and several vocal amens. Gregory's face flushed an even deeper shade of red. "I'm not going to stand here and be insulted," Gregory declared, attempting to reclaim some dignity by starting to move toward the exit. Steve's laughter stopped him in his tracks. A deep, genuine laugh that caught everyone by surprise. "Oh, now you don't want to be insulted? Now you understand how it feels? The difference is, I'm judging you based on your actions, your choices, not something you were born with." The cameras captured every moment as Steve pointed directly at Gregory once more. "And let me be clear about something. This isn't political. This isn't about left or right. Decent people on both sides would be disgusted by what you said." Steve walked to the family podium where Letitia's relatives stood watching the confrontation unfold. He placed a hand on her brother Marcus's shoulder, who had been visibly restraining his anger throughout the exchange. "This man here," Steve said, gesturing to Marcus, "has more self-control than I would in his position. If someone talked to my sister like that..." "Whew." Steve fanned himself dramatically, generating nervous laughter from the audience. "But he's standing here with dignity because that's who he is. That's who this family is." Steve returned to center stage, his expression growing serious once more. "So here's what's going to happen now, Gregory. You have two choices. You can offer Ms. Johnson a genuine apology, not one of those sorry if you were offended non-apologies. Or you can leave this studio knowing that millions of people across America are about to see exactly who you are." The tension in the room reached its peak as Gregory stood at this crossroads. The seconds ticked by, feeling like hours to everyone present. Security guards remained positioned at the ready. The Johnson family watched with steady gazes, and Steve Harvey stood unwavering, an immovable force waiting for Gregory's decision. What happened next would shock everyone in the studio and become one of the most talked about moments in television history. Gregory's decision seemed to unfold in slow motion. His eyes darted between Steve Harvey's unwavering stare, the silent cameras, and the exit doors. Something in his expression hardened, not into remorse, but into a stubborn defiance. "I don't need this," he muttered, loud enough for the microphones to pick up. Without offering the apology Steve had demanded, Gregory turned abruptly and began pushing his way toward the aisle. As he moved, someone in the back of the audience shouted, Coward! The word hung in the air, followed by a smattering of applause that quickly spread throughout the studio. Steve watched him go, shaking his head slowly. "And there it is, folks," he said, his voice tinged with disappointment but not surprise. When confronted with his own actions, the man chooses to run rather than reflect. Security personnel flanked Gregory as he hurried up the aisle, their presence as much for his protection as to ensure his exit. The studio doors swung shut behind him with an audible thud that seemed to punctuate the moment. Steve turned back to Letitia and her family, who had witnessed the entire exchange with remarkable composure. "Ms. Johnson, on behalf of everyone at Family Feud and, frankly, decent people everywhere, I want to apologize for what you experienced today." Letitia nodded, her eyes glistening but her dignity intact. "Thank you, Mr. Harvey." What nobody in the studio realized at that moment was that this confrontation had already transcended the boundaries of a regular Family Feud episode. In the control room, producers were receiving urgent messages from network executives who had been watching the live feed with a mixture of panic and fascination. "We're trending nationwide," the head producer whispered into her headset. "Social media is exploding." Indeed, what had started as a routine recording of America's favorite game show had transformed into a cultural flashpoint. Audience members had discreetly captured portions of the confrontation on their phones, despite strict rules against recording. Clips were already spreading across social media platforms with stunning velocity. Steve Harvey, unaware of the digital firestorm brewing outside the studio walls, refocused the room with the professionalism of a veteran entertainer. "Now, what do y'all say we get back to some Family Feud?" he announced, his trademark smile gradually returning. "Ms. Johnson, you were in the middle of absolutely dominating this game, and I think you've got some money to win for those college funds." The audience erupted in supportive cheers as the game resumed. Letitia, drawing strength from the moment, led her family to a record-breaking victory, their final score among the highest in the show's history. But even as normality seemed to return to the studio, the ripples of what had transpired were spreading far beyond its walls. By the time the Johnson family left the studio that evening, clutching their winning check and surrounded by production assistants, the incident had gone viral. "Steve Harvey Stands Up" was the #1 trending topic on multiple platforms. The clips, though fragmentary and sometimes shaky, had been viewed millions of times. News vans were already gathering outside the studio, reporters eager for statements from anyone who had witnessed the confrontation. Major networks interrupted their regular programming to report on what was being described as a watershed moment in daytime television. Inside his dressing room, Steve sat alone, tie loosened as his phone lit up with notifications. Calls from his manager, his agent, network executives, and even several prominent political figures were coming in rapid succession. He ignored them all, taking a moment to process what had happened. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called. The show's executive producer, Jennifer Lawson, entered with a tablet in hand. "Steve, have you seen what's happening out there?" she asked, her expression a mixture of concern and amazement. Steve shook his head. "I've been avoiding my phone." Jennifer handed him the tablet, open to a social media feed where the hashtag #SteveHarveyStandsUp dominated the screen. Below it were thousands of comments, the vast majority expressing support for his actions. "You're being called a hero," Jennifer said quietly. "This is bigger than anything we've seen before." Steve scrolled through the comments, his expression unreadable. Finally, he set the tablet down and looked up at Jennifer. "I wasn't trying to be a hero. I was just being a human being." "Well, the world is responding," Jennifer replied. "The network president called. They want to air the full, unedited confrontation as a special tomorrow night. Prime time." Steve raised his eyebrows. "Uncensored? They never do that." "They're doing it now," Jennifer confirmed. "They're calling it the moment of truth." As Jennifer continued briefing him on the unprecedented media response, Steve's thoughts drifted to Letitia Johnson and her family. In the midst of all this attention, they were the ones who had been directly hurt by Gregory's hatred. Whatever happened next, Steve resolved to ensure their dignity remained intact. The following morning, America awoke to the confrontation dominating every news cycle. Breakfast shows featured panels of commentators analyzing the exchange, second by second. Cultural critics wrote thoughtful pieces about the significance of such a raw moment happening on daytime television. Radio call-in shows fielded emotional responses from listeners sharing their own experiences with racism. Gregory Whitman, meanwhile, had gone into hiding. Journalists quickly discovered his identity, revealing him as a mid-level executive at a real estate development firm. By noon, his employer had issued a statement distancing themselves from his actions and announcing his suspension pending further investigation. As for Letitia Johnson, she found herself thrust into an unexpected spotlight. Morning shows competed for her first interview, offering significant compensation for her exclusive story. Civil rights organizations reached out to express solidarity. A crowdfunding campaign established by viewers to supplement her Family Feud winnings for her children's education had already surpassed $100,000 and was growing hourly. By evening, the stage was set for the primetime special. Nielsen predicted record-breaking viewership. Social media platforms prepared for unprecedented traffic. And in living rooms across America, people gathered to witness the unedited confrontation that had already become a defining cultural moment. The special opened with Steve Harvey addressing the camera directly. No studio audience, no family contestants. Just Steve speaking from the heart. "What you're about to see wasn't planned," he began, his voice somber yet powerful. "It wasn't scripted. It was simply a moment when staying silent wasn't an option. I'm not sharing this to be celebrated. I'm sharing it because sometimes we need to see ourselves clearly, the good, the bad, and the uncomfortable truth about where we stand when it matters most." As the footage rolled and America watched the full confrontation for the first time, the reaction was seismic. In that moment, Steve Harvey transcended his role as a game show host and comedian. He became something more. A voice that refused to be silent in the face of injustice, even when cameras were rolling. And the ripple effects were only just beginning. In the days following the primetime special, the confrontation between Steve Harvey and Gregory Whitman evolved from viral sensation to cultural touchstone. News outlets labeled it the Harvey moment, shorthand for standing up against racism in real time, regardless of consequences. The unedited footage had been viewed over 200 million times across various platforms, making it one of the most watched non-sporting television events in recent history. For Steve Harvey, the aftermath brought a tsunami of attention. Interview requests flooded in from every major network. The president called personally to commend his courage. Time magazine was preparing a cover story titled "The Moment We Needed." Through it all, Steve maintained a measured response, consistently redirecting attention to the broader issues at play rather than accepting personal accolades. "This isn't about me," he repeated in his first post-incident interview on a major morning show. "This is about the Letitia Johnsons of the world who face this kind of thing every day without cameras rolling, without anyone stepping in to defend them. The Johnson family, meanwhile, was navigating their unexpected fame with remarkable grace. Letitia had accepted a single exclusive interview, using the platform not to dwell on the hurt caused by Gregory's comments, but to highlight the scholarship fund she was establishing with her winnings and the subsequent donations. Sometimes bad intentions create beautiful opportunities, she explained, seated beside her 3 children in their modest living room. This fund isn't just for my kids anymore. It's for any child who needs help overcoming barriers to their education. As for Gregory Whitman, the public response had been swift and severe. His employer had moved from suspension to termination within 48 hours. His social media accounts had been deleted after an avalanche of outraged messages. Several of his business associates publicly distanced themselves. The court of public opinion had rendered its verdict, and Gregory had essentially vanished from public view, until the letter arrived at the Family Feud production offices, addressed simply, "For Steve Harvey and Letitia Johnson." "I'm not sure about this," Letitia said, seated across from Steve in his private office at the studio 1 week after the incident. Between them on the desk lay Gregory's unopened letter. Steve nodded thoughtfully. "I understand your hesitation. You've been through enough. If you want to tear it up, or if you want me to read it first, whatever makes you comfortable." Letitia studied the envelope for a long moment. "No, I'll read it. We'll read it together." With steady hands, she opened the envelope and unfolded 3 handwritten pages. She began reading aloud. "Mr. Harvey and Miss Johnson, there is no adequate way to begin this letter. No greeting that feels appropriate after what I said and did. I've written and rewritten these words dozens of times, knowing they cannot undo the hurt I caused. Since that day in the studio, my life has collapsed around me. I've lost my job, my reputation, and the respect of colleagues and friends. But the greatest loss has been my own self-respect, as I've been forced to confront an ugly truth. I am the villain in this story. For days, I blamed everyone but myself. I blamed the cancel culture. I blamed the media. I blamed Mr. Harvey for publicly humiliating me. I even blamed Ms. Johnson for being the target of my hatred. The irony of a man like me claiming to be a victim was completely lost on me. It wasn't until my 14-year-old daughter came to me in tears, saying she was ashamed to go to school because everyone knew her father was that racist man from TV, that something finally broke inside me. Something had to break for the light to get in. What I said to Ms. Johnson was inexcusable. It revealed a darkness in me that I've spent days trying to understand. Where does such hatred come from? I've traced it back through my life. The casual racism in my household growing up, the segregated neighborhood where I was raised, the echo chambers I've lived in as an adult. None of these explain my actions, but they helped me recognize patterns I've never questioned until now. Ms. Johnson, I cannot imagine the pain my words caused you on what should have been a joyful day for your family. You showed more dignity in those moments than I have shown in my entire life. There is no apology sufficient for what I did. But I offer one nonetheless, with full understanding that you owe me neither forgiveness nor response. Mr. Harvey, you asked me to look at myself that day, and I finally have. What I've seen has shaken me to my core. Your willingness to stand up, to use your platform to confront hatred, rather than ignore it for the sake of entertainment, has forced me to examine beliefs I've harbored without question. I don't expect or deserve a second chance in the public eye, but I am asking myself for one, a chance to rebuild my life around better values. to teach my daughters through my actions that it's never too late to face your failures and try to become a better person. With profound regret and deepest apologies, Gregory Whitman. Letitia finished reading, her voice steady despite the emotion evident in her eyes. She carefully refolded the letter and placed it back on the desk. The silence between them stretched for several moments before Steve spoke. "What are you thinking?" he asked gently. Letitia took a deep breath. "I'm thinking about something my grandmother used to say. Hate corrodes the vessel that carries it." Looking at these words, I can see a man who's been corroded from the inside for a very long time. Steve nodded. "Do you believe he's sincere?" "I don't know," Letitia admitted. "But I do know that holding on to anger wouldn't serve me or my children." She paused, considering her next words carefully. "I'm not ready to forgive him, but I'm willing to acknowledge that even the worst moment of a person's life doesn't have to define them forever." Steve leaned back in his chair, visibly moved by her perspective. "You continue to amaze me with your grace, Ms. Johnson." "It's not grace," she replied with quiet certainty. "It's survival. When you've faced what Black women in America have faced, you learn that bitterness is a luxury you can't afford. My children are watching how I respond to this. That matters more to me than anything." Steve considered this, then reached for his phone. "I have an idea, but it would be entirely your choice, and I would support whatever you decide." "What kind of idea?" Letitia asked, curiosity replacing the heaviness in her expression. "What if we invited Gregory to meet with us? Not on camera, not for publicity, just a human conversation. No obligation to forgive. No pressure to resolve everything. Just an opportunity to speak and be heard in a more private setting." Letitia didn't answer immediately. She looked down at her hands, then out the window at the Los Angeles skyline, and finally back at Steve. "Set it up," she said simply. 3 days later, in a small conference room at the network offices, Gregory Whitman sat alone at a table, nervously adjusting his tie. The door opened, and Steve Harvey entered first, followed by Letitia Johnson. No cameras, no audience. Just 3 people about to have one of the most difficult conversations of their lives. What transpired in that room would never be fully shared with the public. Some moments of reckoning are too personal, too raw for mass consumption. But the meeting lasted over 4 hours, and when they finally emerged, something had shifted in all 3 of them. The only statement they released was brief and joint-signed. "Today, we met as human beings, not as symbols or characters in a viral moment. We spoke honestly about pain, prejudice, and the possibility of growth. We make no claims of easy resolution or storybook endings. Real healing isn't a spectacle. It's a process. We ask for privacy as we each continue our individual journeys forward." The media speculation was immediate and intense, but Steve, Letitia, and Gregory maintained their silence about the details of their conversation. Some things, they had agreed, belonged to them alone. What became clear in the weeks that followed, however, was that all 3 had been profoundly changed by both the incident and its aftermath. Gregory quietly began volunteering at a community center in a predominantly Black neighborhood. Letitia's scholarship fund grew beyond anyone's expectations, eventually partnering with a major foundation to expand its reach. And Steve incorporated discussions about confronting racism into his comedy tours and speaking engagements, using his platform to encourage others to have difficult conversations. The Family Feud episode itself never aired in its original form. Instead, with Letitia's permission, Portions of the confrontation were incorporated into a special program about addressing racism in everyday life, featuring experts, advocates, and ordinary people sharing their experiences and insights. 6 months after the Harvey moment, public interest had largely moved on to other viral sensations and controversies. But in community centers, classrooms, and dinner tables across America, conversations continued. Uncomfortable, necessary conversations about the courage it takes to stand up, the pain of being targeted, and the hard work of genuine redemption. And perhaps that was the most important aftermath of all. 1 year to the day after the confrontation that changed their lives, Steve Harvey welcomed a special guest onto his talk show. The audience erupted in applause as Letitia Johnson walked onto the stage, confident and poised in a vibrant blue dress that contrasted beautifully with her complexion. The two embraced warmly before taking their seats, both visibly moved by the significance of the anniversary they were marking together. "It's been exactly 1 year," Steve began, once the applause had died down, his voice carrying the weight of reflection. 1 year since a moment that neither of us planned became something much bigger than ourselves. 1 year since a regular day at Family Feud turned into something that would change not just our lives, but spark conversations across America. "How are you feeling today, Letitia?" She smiled, the expression reaching her eyes in a way that conveyed genuine peace. "Grateful, Steve. Mostly just grateful. When I walked into that studio a year ago, I was just thinking about winning money for my children's education. I never imagined I'd be sitting here with you today, talking about everything that's happened since." The camera panned to show the audience where Letitia's 3 children sat in the front row, beaming with pride. Her oldest, now a sophomore at Howard University, gave her a thumbs up. Beside them sat Letitia's parents, brother, and several other family members who had supported her throughout the tumultuous year. The Letitia Johnson Scholarship Foundation has now helped over 200 students access higher education, Steve announced, triggering another round of applause. That's 200 young people who might not otherwise have had the opportunity to pursue their dreams. 200 futures forever altered because of something that began in pain, but transformed into purpose. "And we're just getting started," Letitia added, leaning forward with intensity. "Last month, we secured a major partnership with 3 historically Black colleges and universities to create dedicated scholarship tracks for single parents. What began as a response to hatred has transformed into something beautiful and enduring. Sometimes I think about how different things would be if that incident had never happened. My children would still be struggling to afford college. Those 200 students wouldn't have their scholarships. It's strange how life works, isn't it?" Steve nodded thoughtfully, adjusting his signature suit as he often did when processing deep emotions. "That's something I've reflected on a lot this past year. How moments of darkness can sometimes lead to unexpected light. How sometimes the worst experiences can catalyze the most meaningful change." The studio lights dimmed slightly as Steve transitioned the conversation. "You know, Letitia, in my 40-plus years in entertainment, I've experienced my share of unscripted moments. But nothing prepared me for what happened that day on set. Looking back now, what stands out most to you?" Letitia took a moment before answering, her hands folded carefully in her lap. What stands out most isn't actually Gregory's hateful words, though they certainly cut deep at the time. What I remember most vividly is the silence right after, that terrible, hanging silence when everyone froze, not knowing what would happen next. She paused, her voice strengthening. "And then I remember you standing up, Steve. Not just physically, but standing up for what was right. That's the moment that changed everything." Several audience members nodded in agreement, a few wiping away tears. "I didn't do anything special," Steve said, genuine humility in his tone. "Any decent person would have done the same." "But that's just it," Letitia countered gently. "Many decent people stay silent in those moments. They think someone else will speak up, or they worry about making things uncomfortable. You didn't hesitate, and that made all the difference." The conversation shifted as Steve addressed the audience directly. "What many of you don't know is what happened behind the scenes after that day. With Letitia's permission, we're going to share something we've kept private until now. Something only a small circle of people have been aware of." A screen descended behind them, and the audience fell silent as footage began to play. Not from the confrontation itself, which had been seen by millions, but from an event 6 months later that had never been made public. The video showed a community center gymnasium filled with teenagers from diverse backgrounds. At first, the camera focused on the young faces, some attentive, others skeptical, all curious. Then it panned to reveal Gregory Whitman standing at a podium, visibly nervous as he addressed the young people before him. "My name is Gregory Whitman," he began on the video, his voice slightly trembling. "And I'm here because I did something terrible. Something that, if you've been on social media at all in the past year, you probably already know about. I used racist language to attack someone I didn't know simply because of the color of her skin. I humiliated myself on national television, lost my job, and became a social pariah overnight." He paused, taking a deep breath. "But that's not why I'm standing in front of you today. I'm not here to make excuses for what I did. I'm here because Ms. Johnson and Mr. Harvey gave me an opportunity I didn't deserve. The chance to turn my worst moment into a catalyst for change." The camera panned to show Letitia sitting quietly at the back of the gymnasium, watching Gregory's presentation with composed dignity. Next to her sat a youth counselor who had helped organize the event, part of a restorative justice initiative that had grown out of their private meeting months earlier. "After I lost my job and my reputation," Gregory continued in the video, his hands gripping the podium tightly, "I could have retreated into bitterness. I could have doubled down and claimed I was the victim of cancel culture. Many people in my position do exactly that. Instead, I had to face some hard truths about beliefs I'd never questioned, beliefs that had been passed down to me, that I had absorbed from my environment, that I had never bothered to examine until my entire life collapsed around me." The footage showed Gregory stepping away from the podium, moving closer to the students as his confidence grew. "I've spent the past 6 months working with anti-racism educators, reading books I should have read decades ago, and most importantly, listening to experiences that are different from my own. I've had to unlearn things I thought were true. I've had to acknowledge privileges I never recognized. And I've had to accept that this work doesn't have an end point. It's a lifelong commitment to doing better than I did before." A student raised their hand in the video. "Do you think you deserve forgiveness?" the young person asked bluntly. Gregory's response was measured and thoughtful. "I don't think forgiveness is something you can deserve or demand. It's a gift that can only be freely given. What I'm focused on isn't earning forgiveness, but becoming someone who wouldn't cause that kind of harm again. That's the only thing within my control." As the footage played, the studio audience watched in rapt attention. Some wiped away tears as Gregory described specific steps he'd taken, from therapy focused on understanding the roots of his prejudice, to regular volunteering with community organizations serving minority populations. The video showed him working alongside people of color in a community garden, awkward at first, but gradually finding a rhythm of mutual respect. The most powerful moment came when Gregory described bringing his teenage daughter to meet Letitia's children. "My daughter saw in me the worst version of who I could be," he said, voice breaking. "Now I'm trying to show her a better path, not through words, but through actions. We can't change the past, but we can change what we teach the next generation." The video concluded with a simple scene. Gregory, Letitia, and a group of students engaged in an honest dialogue about racism, privilege, and reconciliation. Not as perfect exemplars of harmony, but as real people doing the difficult work of human connection across divides. When the lights came up in the studio, Steve turned to Letitia. "We decided to share this today because there's a part of this story that got lost in all the headlines and viral clips. The hard, unglamorous work of what happens after a moment of reckoning." Letitia nodded, smoothing her dress as she gathered her thoughts. "Gregory and I will never be best friends," she said candidly, her voice steady. "That's not what this is about. Our relationship will always carry the echo of how it began. But watching him work with those students, seeing him use his experience to help others examine their own biases, that's what redemption looks like in real life. Not perfect, not complete, but genuine." She continued, "People often ask if I've forgiven him, and that's a complicated question. What I can say is that I've chosen not to let that moment of hatred define either of us. I've chosen to focus on the transformation that followed." Steve addressed the audience again, his expression serious. "Gregory couldn't be here today, and that was his choice. When we invited him to join us, he declined, saying he felt his presence would make this conversation about him, when it should be about the work Letitia is doing and the larger issues at stake. That itself shows a level of growth from where he started." "He sent a message, though," Letitia added, pulling a card from her purse. "With his permission, I'd like to read what he wrote. The greatest lesson I've learned is that change isn't a destination, it's a practice. I'm still practicing every day. The path from being part of the problem to being part of the solution isn't straight or easy, but it's necessary. I'm grateful for the difficult grace that allowed me to find this path, even though I stumbled onto it through my own failure." The studio was silent as the weight of these words settled over the audience. Steve allowed the moment to breathe before gently shifting the conversation. "Let's talk about the ripple effects," he said. "Beyond your foundation and Gregory's personal journey, this incident sparked something much larger." The screen behind them displayed headlines from the past year, demonstrating the broader impact of what had come to be known simply as the moment. How a confrontation on a game show had sparked discussions in schools, workplaces, and houses of worship across America. How it had inspired a documentary about everyday courage and a curriculum about bystander intervention that was now being implemented in over 500 schools nationwide. How it had prompted other public figures to speak out rather than stay silent when witnessing discrimination. State legislators in 12 states have cited this incident specifically while introducing bills to strengthen anti-discrimination protections, Steve noted. 3 major television networks have revised their protocols for handling discriminatory language during live broadcasts. And perhaps most significantly, a national dialogue has emerged about what true accountability and redemption might look like in our polarized society. Letitia nodded. "I've received thousands of letters from people sharing their own stories, both of experiencing discrimination and of confronting their own prejudices. One woman wrote that watching you stand up for me, Steve, gave her the courage to finally address racist comments in her workplace after years of suffering in silence." "That's humbling to hear," Steve responded, visibly moved. But I think what many people connect with isn't just the moment of confrontation, but what came after. The hard work of healing and growth that happens away from the cameras. At this point, Steve invited several special guests to join them on stage. Individuals who had been directly impacted by the moment and its aftermath. A high school principal described how his school had used the incident as a teaching tool, leading to a student-led initiative to address microaggressions in the hallways. A corporate diversity officer explained how she had shown clips from the confrontation during training sessions, transforming abstract concepts into concrete discussions about workplace culture. Most movingly, a mother and her teenage son shared how watching the incident together had opened up their first real conversation about racism. My son asked me why I never said anything when people made comments about our family, the woman explained, her voice thick with emotion. He's biracial, and I realized I had been teaching him through my silence that he should just accept disrespect. That changed after we watched Mr. Harvey stand up for Ms. Johnson. As the segment neared its conclusion, Steve asked Letitia a final question. If you could go back to that day, knowing everything that would follow, the pain and the progress, the criticism and the change, would you change anything about how it all unfolded? Letitia considered this carefully before answering, the camera capturing the thoughtfulness in her expression. I wouldn't change what happened, because I've seen too much good come from it. The scholarships, the conversations, the awareness, all of that matters deeply. But I would tell myself something that took me months to fully understand. That standing in your truth, even when it's painful, creates space for healing that silence never could. That's what I hope people remember from all of this. Not just the confrontation, but the courage to speak truth and the commitment to grow from it. The camera pulled back as Steve and Letitia stood to embrace once more. The audience rose in a standing ovation that seemed to celebrate not just two individuals, but a moment that had transcended its circumstances to become something universally human. A reminder that how we respond when tested reveals not just who we are, but who we might become. Behind them on the screen appeared photographs showing the impact of Letitia's foundation, students in graduation caps and gowns, community events bringing diverse groups together, and a newly constructed community center in Letitia's hometown that would serve as both an educational resource and a monument to what could grow from confronting hatred with dignity. As the credits began to roll, viewers at home saw a final graphic appear on screen. A simple quote from Maya Angelou that had become the unofficial motto of Letitia's foundation. Do the best you can until you know better. Then, when you know better, do better. In that quote lay the essence of what had unfolded from a single moment of confrontation on a game show stage. Not a perfect resolution wrapped in a tidy bow, but the messy, ongoing work of human growth. The recognition that redemption isn't an event but a process, that courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes standing your ground changes not just your own story, but creates ripples that touch shores you never imagined reaching. The episode concluded with an announcement. Steve Harvey and Letitia Johnson were launching a national initiative called The Moment Project, dedicated to creating spaces for difficult conversations about race and reconciliation. The project would include community forums, educational resources, and annual scholarships for students committed to social justice work. Because sometimes, Steve's voice explained as the screen faded to black, the most important moments are the ones we never saw coming. The ones that test who we are and show us who we can be. This isn't the end of the story. In many ways, it's just the beginning. And across America, Viewers nodded in agreement, understanding that what they had witnessed wasn't simply the conclusion of a year-long saga, but an invitation to examine their own lives, their own moments of choice, and their own capacity for both courage and growth. In living rooms and classrooms, in boardrooms and houses of worship, the conversation continued. Not just about a confrontation on a game show, but about the society we share and the future we create. One difficult, necessary moment at a time.